Camille Worthington had never once called Mason Hart by name. To the CEO of Worthington Dynamics, the quiet single father behind the wheel was simply the driver, a human fixture designed to open doors, maintain silence, and disappear the moment she stepped out of the car. On the night her motorcade left the biggest signing ceremony in company history, 3 black SUVs sealed off the bridge ahead, her security detail vanished from the radio, and every person moving toward her vehicle wore a mask and held formation. They had come to take Camille alive. But before they reached her door, the man she had spent years humiliating loosened his tie, changed the route, and showed her exactly who he was. Stay with the story, because the driver every boardroom overlooked is about to bring an empire of power to its knees before the night is through. The morning of the Worthington Dynamics acquisition signing arrived the way big days always did in Camille's life, with precision, pressure, and no room for inconvenience. Mason Hart pulled the black sedan to the front of the Worthington estate at 7:45, the same time he had arrived every working morning for 6 years, and he sat with the engine idling and his eyes moving the way they always did, scanning the perimeter with a patience that looked like stillness but was something else entirely. He had noticed the gray sedan parked on the far side of the hedge 2 mornings in a row. Same position, no commercial markings, no visible occupant, and he catalogued it without alarm, the way a man trained to observe treats anything that doesn't yet have an explanation. The second detail arrived when Dorian Pike sent a route update at 7:53, 11 minutes before Camille was due in the vehicle, switching the path to the hotel from the northern corridor to a crossing that ran over the Kelvin Street Bridge. A route Mason had flagged in an internal memo the prior year as a secondary priority because it offered fewer alternate exits and longer exposure at the midpoint. The third anomaly was the escort vehicles. The 2 black sedans that usually flanked Camille's car were gone, replaced by a pair of SUVs he did not recognize, driven by men whose faces he had not seen at a single prior briefing, wearing security credentials that were laminated differently from the standard issue. He noted all 3 in the order he had observed them, then waited. Mason reported the anomalies when Camille descended the front steps in a charcoal blazer with her phone already raised. Mid-conversation, her attention directed at a horizon that did not include him. He waited for her to finish the call and then kept it brief. Unfamiliar vehicles on the approach, a route alteration without a stated reason, an unrecognized escort team, and Camille listened just long enough to register that he was speaking before she looked past him toward the open car door. She told him the route had been cleared by her head of security, that the vehicles had been approved by her operations office, and that she had 12 hours to complete the most important business day of the past 4 years, which left no time for a driver to second-guess the professionals she paid to manage exactly these decisions. Mason asked if he could at least verify the escort credentials with Dorian directly, and Camille said, without looking back, that she paid him to hold the wheel, not run her schedule, and she got into the car. He sat in the front and made one short call before putting the vehicle in drive, a call to a separate phone he kept in the glove compartment for this one purpose, connecting to a voice he recognized without needing her to say hello. His daughter Lily, 13 years old and running slightly late for school, reminded him that he had promised to be home before she went to sleep, and Mason told her he intended to be, and when she said she always waited anyway, he did not argue, because it was both a problem and the truest thing she said. He set the phone in the compartment, joined the motorcade, and drove toward the hotel in silence, watching the mirror. At the hotel's motor court, The receiving committee gathered at the entrance while Camille's car pulled to the curb, and Mason stepped out and opened her rear door with the unhurried efficiency that had made him invisible to every person on the property, except the ones who paid attention to the staff. Camille walked through the parting crowd without breaking stride, eyes fixed on the entrance, and the gap between her shoulder and the door Mason held might as well have been the distance between the pavement and a passing cloud. Dorian Pike stood near the hotel steps with 2 members of the new security team, and when Mason came around the car, Dorian turned just enough to address him in the tone of a man who has practiced contempt until it feels casual. Calling him the driver from the old man's era, telling him the day's logistics were handled, suggesting that if he needed something to occupy his time, he could confirm the parking arrangement with the hotel attendant. Mason did not respond. He walked back to the sedan and, while he did, took a small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote down the license plate of the gray SUV that had followed the motorcade from the estate. He spent the next 40 minutes in the parking structure cross-referencing that plate against a record he maintained on a personal device. A habit from another life, another version of himself that very few people in this building knew had ever existed. The result came back faster than he had expected. The plate was registered to a logistics subsidiary of Worthington Dynamics that had been formally dissolved 3 years earlier, a subsidiary that, according to the public record, no longer operated any vehicles at all. The Worthington Dynamics acquisition ceremony filled the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel with the kind of controlled electricity that attends a deal so large it stops feeling like business and starts feeling like theater. $1,400,000,000 moved through a signature, and the room treated it the way rooms full of investors always treat the prospect of compounding money, with sustained applause and the particular relief that sounds like celebration. Camille stood at the podium in front of 200 people who had paid significant attention to get into the room, and she spoke about vision and infrastructure technology and the next generation of market positioning, and she was convincing in the exact way that years of learning her audience's language could make a person convincing. Julian Lockridge stood to her left and slightly behind, occupying the posture of a man who has mastered the geometry of proximity without overreach, close enough to signal partnership, far enough back to appear deferential. Mason was in the service corridor that ran along the hotel's east wing, seated on a folding chair near the kitchen entrance, where the catering staff moved with the tight efficiency of people who had run this particular kind of function enough times to operate it in their sleep. Nora Bell found him there during the reception portion of the evening, carrying a plate she had asked the kitchen to set aside, and she placed it on the small table beside him and asked, without the careful professional distance that most of the executive staff maintained toward anyone below a certain pay grade, why he was back here rather than at the event. Mason said this was where the staff waited, and Nora said she knew that, but that she had seen his name in files predating most of the people currently calling themselves senior leadership, and it seemed to her a strange place to put someone with that kind of history in the organization. Dorian was moving through the corridor at that moment, and he stopped just long enough to look at both of them and say, with the particular performance of amusement that signals irritation, that no one should be in the business of turning a door opener into a board member, and then walked on. After the formal program concluded and guests moved to the reception floor, Camille emerged from the ballroom and crossed to the motor court to check the vehicle arrangement before departure. and found Mason's sedan parked 8 meters from the position Dorian had designated on the building schematic. Her expression shifted in the way her staff had learned to recognize. The controlled quality disappeared and something more direct came through. She asked Mason, in a voice calibrated for clarity and minimal warmth, why the vehicle was not where it had been placed, and Mason pointed to the spot Dorian had chosen, the northwest corner of the court, tucked against a wall that the hotel's external camera network did not cover, adjacent to a loading lane where a refrigerated delivery truck had been parked, engine running, unattended for the past 40 minutes. He said the current position gave him 3 exit options instead of 1, and that the truck warranted a closer look. Camille studied the truck, then looked at Mason, then at the small cluster of executive staff and hotel managers watching from a polite distance, and told him clearly that if he moved the vehicle without authorization again, she would end his employment that night. Julian appeared behind her and placed a gentle hand at her elbow, murmuring something about the stress of the day, and Camille relaxed by a degree. But the look she gave Mason as she turned away carried none of the consideration she had just extended to Julian's calm voice. Nora Bell, back inside the building, was reviewing the documents Camille would need at the bank the following morning, and she found something she had not been looking for. Camille's financial authentication access had been expanded 2 hours earlier to a 6-hour window, a change that corresponded to no request in the system, no board directive, no document Camille had signed. Nora tried to pull the changelog. The terminal returned an access error. She tried from her own login and found her account privileges reduced to read-only status, without notification. She stood up and went to find Mason. Mason was not in the building. He was in the motor court, watching Dorian speak quietly into a phone near the valet stand, and he watched Dorian end the call and then walk to the 2 escort SUVs and speak to the drivers. And he watched both vehicles pull out of the court one after the other and disappear into the traffic on Meridian Avenue. Dorian told the remaining event staff that there had been an accident on the primary route and that the escort vehicles were being redirected for crowd management. No replacement vehicles were called. No additional personnel arrived. Camille came out 7 minutes later, stopped at the sedan, waited for Mason to open the rear door, and got in without looking at him. She said they could leave. Mason put the sedan in gear, and as the car turned onto the street and the hotel lights fell away behind them, he checked the mirror and saw 3 sets of headlights moving in coordinated pattern in the lanes to the rear, maintaining interval, accelerating together. The bridge appeared out of the dark at the end of Kelvin Street, the way Mason had known it would. A single span crossing over a dry rail corridor, 3 lanes wide and almost entirely without witness at this hour, and the SUV came from the opposite direction and stopped crossways in the 2 far lanes before Camille had registered that anything was wrong. She saw the obstruction and said there must be an incident ahead, some overnight work, and asked Mason to stop. Mason did not stop. He had already seen the 2 vehicles that had followed them accelerate from behind and lock the sedan into the remaining lane, and he had seen the people who stepped out of the blocking SUV. 4 of them, moving with the practiced spacing of a team that has rehearsed this specific choreography, their faces covered, their hands empty in the way experienced operatives keep hands empty when minimizing the visual threat of approach. He locked all 4 doors with a single press, cut the interior lights, and disabled the company tracking system from a switch on the center console that most drivers did not know existed. A vehicle bearing the color scheme of a private security contractor appeared from a side street, and positioned itself as though offering assistance, and Mason watched it come to rest at an angle that blocked rather than cleared the intersection, and he registered that the transponder light pattern on its roof was running the wrong sequence for any contractor he had ever worked alongside. Camille told him to roll down the window and explain the situation to the security contractor, and he told her the vehicle was not what it claimed to be, that the transponder was wrong, that the people outside were not there to help, and she told him he was overreacting, that this was exactly the kind of situation Dorian's team was trained to handle, and he told her, without raising his voice, to hold on to the door handle. What followed was not a chase in the way that phrase implies spectacle. Mason used the sedan with precision and without waste, working the geometry of the bridge against the vehicles trying to contain it. He found a gap between the blocking SUV and the bridge railing, less than a meter of clearance, and took it at a speed that made contact unavoidable but controlled, the sedan's right panel scraping the concrete barrier in a sound that brought Camille upright with both hands against the door. The car rocked, stabilized, and came off the bridge onto a service road behind a strip of closed commercial units, and Mason pushed the engine until they were 3 blocks clear before making a turn that no one who hadn't driven this route in daylight and cataloged its geometry on purpose would have known to make. Glass from the rear window had come in at the moment of impact, and a piece had caught his shoulder. He felt the warmth of it, but kept both hands level on the wheel, and his voice level when he spoke. Camille's phone was in her hand, and she was already dialing Dorian, and Mason said her name, not her title, just her name, the first time in 6 years he had used it in direct address, and told her that Dorian was the only person who had known the exact route they were taking tonight, the only person who had withdrawn the escort vehicles before the ambush, the only person who had been given the timing of their departure down to the minute, and that if she dialed that number she would be confirming to the architect of the attack that they had survived it. Camille lowered the phone by a fraction. Then she raised it again and told him he had motive to be the one lying to her, that he had just demonstrated skills no ordinary driver possesses, and that she had no independent reason to trust his account of this night over the account being assembled by people she employed and had known for years. Mason drove without speaking for another 1.5 blocks, then turned into an access road behind an industrial maintenance facility and brought the sedan into a bay at the far end of a building that had not been actively used in some time. Inside the structure, behind a steel panel he located without searching, was a second vehicle, dark, nondescript, with a clean plate and a full tank. He came around to open her door, not because the job required it in this moment, but because it was still the thing he did, and told her she was welcome to call anyone she chose, but to consider who, other than Dorian, had known they would cross the Kelvin Street Bridge tonight. Then he removed his jacket, examined the wound at his shoulder with the calm of a person taking inventory, and told her they needed to move before the people on the bridge finished covering the industrial district systematically. Camille asked, with something between suspicion and the first edge of genuine uncertainty, where a driver learned to do what he had just done. Mason said, without looking up from the jacket he was pressing against the injury, that she had never asked what he did before he started opening her car door. Camille told him to stop the vehicle. She held out her hand and said she wanted his phone, and when Mason pulled to the side without argument, she said she had been working alongside Julian Lockridge for 9 years, through a hostile buyout attempt, through a 14-month regulatory investigation, through the death of her father, and the transition that followed. and that a single night's crisis was not going to dismantle an architecture built from that kind of proximity and visible loyalty. Mason did not argue about the phone or about Julian. He spoke in the orderly, even manner of a person presenting evidence rather than making an appeal, and he listed the facts without editorial. Dorian had changed the route 11 minutes before departure, not in response to a real-time situation. The escort vehicles had been withdrawn on Dorian's personal instruction, rather than recalled by dispatch. The 3 SUVs on the bridge matched the profile of the gray vehicle that had surveilled the estate for 2 consecutive mornings. Julian's phone had transmitted a text message during the period when every company communication system had allegedly lost signal, meaning at least one device on the network had maintained connectivity throughout, and one of the bridge vehicles carried a registration traceable to a logistics subsidiary wound down 3 years ago under Julian's operational authority. Camille received each point the way a person receives information that conflicts with a prior decision, with the face of someone running alternative calculations without wanting to be observed doing so. She said the word circumstantial, and he said he agreed, which was precisely why he needed her to stay clear of the building long enough to build something better. He drove the remaining distance to a former fleet maintenance garage in the Western Industrial Corridor, a building that presented as disused on the outside and had been maintained with a degree of care on the inside that the exterior was not designed to advertise. Mason found the first aid kit without turning on more than one light, and he dressed the wound at his shoulder with the economy of motion that comes from having done this kind of thing without assistance before. Camille moved through the space with the wariness of someone whose default response to discomfort is observation, and she stopped in front of a shelving unit near the far wall. There was a photograph. It had been placed inside a clear sleeve and stored behind a set of technical manuals, and it showed a younger version of Mason Hart, not dramatically younger, but without the particular stillness that 6 years of deliberate invisibility had layered onto him. Standing in a security professional's dark uniform beside a man she recognized from every significant memory of her childhood and adolescence. Her father, Theodore Worthington, alive and looking at Mason with the specific expression he reserved for people whose competence he found genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. The image was dated 12 years prior. Camille held it and said nothing for a moment that was longer than most of the silences she permitted herself. Mason told her the outline without being asked. 12 years ago, he had led protective transport operations for Theodore's executive travel division, had moved a convoy of senior leadership out of a coordinated industrial sabotage that should have been unforeseeable and would have been catastrophic, and had done so, using nothing more than a route assessment he had run that morning, and the conviction that something about the day's configuration warranted preparation. Theodore had brought him into the company's internal structure afterward and asked him to build the protective protocols that Dorian now administered, or rather, had dismantled. Mason's wife had died 4 years after that, a quiet and entirely unrelated tragedy that had nonetheless reorganized every architecture of his priorities, and he had asked Theodore's successor for a transfer to a role with stable hours and no field exposure because he had a daughter who was 9 years old and who had just lost her mother and who needed a parent who came home on schedule. Dorian had been appointed to lead the security division and had systematically removed Mason's records from the departmental files on the premise that old protocols were being replaced. He had remained as a driver because the work was steady, the hours were manageable, and Lily needed the version of him that arrived home in time to sit at the kitchen table and ask about her day. Camille looked at the photograph and then at him. She asked why he had never told anyone who he was. Mason adjusted the dressing on his shoulder and said that she had never asked his name, which had given his history approximately no opportunity at all. Then the communications device he had retrieved from a locked case in the back of the garage emitted a data alert he had configured for monitoring financial system activity, and the readout showed that executive authentication protocols linked to Camille's credentials were being initiated at the Worthington Dynamics headquarters building. Camille was on her feet before the alert finished processing, and she said they needed to return to headquarters immediately, that if someone was accessing her authentication systems in the middle of the night without her physical presence, every minute of delay was costing her in ways that could not be recovered. Mason said headquarters was exactly where whoever had arranged the bridge would expect them to surface, and that the building's current security configuration was under Dorian's residual authority, which meant walking through the front entrance would be roughly equivalent to calling ahead to announce their arrival. Camille said it was her company, her systems, her people, and that she was not going to remain in a maintenance garage while her authority was stripped in real time. Mason said that if she walked into that building before they understood what was waiting, she would not walk back out as CEO. The certainty in his voice landed in the space between them with enough weight to hold her still for 3 full seconds. More stillness than Camille Worthington had demonstrated in any one place all evening. He reached Naomi Keene through the independent channel on the communications device. Naomi answered on the second signal with the quality of someone already awake and unsurprised to hear from him. Mason gave her the bridge, the time window, the plate from the SUV, and the name Dorian Pike, and asked her to run it quietly. She called back inside 8 minutes with confirmation that no law enforcement or contracted security vehicle had been dispatched to Kelvin Street that night, that a false emergency report had redirected available units to a warehouse fire that could not be located on arrival, that the traffic monitoring infrastructure on the Kelvin corridor had experienced an 11-minute interruption beginning at 9:51, and that a private security contractor registered to a Delaware holding company with Dorian Pike, listed as a minority stakeholder, had taken delivery of 3 late-model SUVs on a 7-day rental agreement that same afternoon. Camille listened to all of this through the device's speaker. When the call ended, she did not immediately speak, and in that silence, Mason watched her reassemble something. Not certainty, but the architecture of reasonable doubt applied to the man she had been defending, which was a different and slower and more significant thing. She said she understood that Dorian had been involved and that it required addressing, but she was not prepared to accept that Julian was part of it. Mason said he understood, and that he was not asking her to accept anything she did not yet have evidence for. That was when Nora's message came through the secondary device, a text from an emergency contact number that Nora had registered with Mason's office 6 months earlier in a protocol Mason had instituted, and that Dorian's restructuring had failed to remove from the system because Dorian had not known it existed. Nora reported that Julian had called an emergency board session for 6 o'clock that morning, and that his notification to board members described Camille as having gone missing in the company of her driver following an incident at the hotel, with circumstances that remained under investigation. Julian had also provided the police department's overnight duty officer with a voluntary disclosure that included financial records, suggesting Mason had accumulated personal debt significant enough to constitute a motive for holding a high-net-worth individual for leverage. The shape of the play settled into the space like something physical. Julian had constructed a scenario in which Mason was the criminal, Camille was the victim of an employee's desperation, Julian was the responsible executive who had identified the threat and acted, and the board had every reason to transfer interim authority to the one person who appeared to have behaved correctly throughout the crisis. Camille sat on a metal case near the wall and looked at Mason with an expression that was not quite the expression she had been wearing all evening. He was watching the door, checking the window line, estimating with automatic precision how much time remained before the people who had lost them on the bridge finished covering the industrial district systematically. She was watching him do all of it, and she was thinking something that her face did not yet have the exact shape for. Then Nora's follow-up arrived. Julian was preparing to release a recorded audio segment at the 6 o'clock meeting, a segment in which Camille's voice, in her own cadences and her own particular vocabulary, authorized the transfer of executive decision-making authority to the CO on a voluntary and temporary basis. Camille explained the structure of the acquisition in the precise, compressed language she used when she did not want to have to explain anything twice. The deal signed that evening would, upon regulatory clearance, move a substantial block of equity into a discretionary investment vehicle that she alone was authorized to direct. The window for that clearance was 60 hours from execution. If her executive authority transferred before that window closed, if a valid power of attorney, authenticated by her biometrics and supported by board approval, went into effect, Julian would step into operational control at the exact moment the equity block became accessible and the acquisition fund became liquid. One person, positioned correctly at the right hour, could redirect $380 million into a vehicle that would take months to trace and longer to recover. Julian had not wanted a ransom. He had wanted a key, and Camille's hands, voice, and personal authorization codes were the only mechanism that could turn it. Mason and Naomi, speaking through the device in tandem, worked through the list of what the team on the bridge had required from Camille. Fingerprint authentication at a mobile verification terminal, voice confirmation through a phrase-specific recording, the personal numeric sequence she used for fund authorization, a video statement in which she appeared to step down voluntarily on grounds of health, and physical presence within the system's geographic authentication range. The operation had been designed around the certainty that she would be taken intact and coherent, brought through each step in sequence, and returned to visibility afterward as a CEO who had suffered a breakdown and made impulsive financial decisions, a story difficult to disprove and nearly impossible to reverse before the board meeting. Mason recalled a detail that had lodged in the sensory record of the bridge. One of the operatives, shouting across the roof of the blocking SUV to another, had said clearly not to damage her hands. It was a short operational instruction, and it told him more than any confession would have. The team had been briefed on the biometric component, given specific instructions about preserving her physical functionality, and had approached the sedan not as a vehicle to stop, but as a container to open without breaking what was inside. Nora located a document in Julian's executive file system, a draft announcement prepared in his name and timestamped the prior afternoon, that described Camille as having suffered psychological instability in the weeks surrounding the acquisition, documented an unauthorized fund movement she had allegedly executed under impaired judgment, and positioned Julian's assumption of the CEO role as a stabilizing intervention undertaken reluctantly in the interest of shareholders. It was meticulously written and specific enough in its invented detail that it would have taken weeks to disprove, weeks during which Julian would hold the seat and ensure the documentation continued to support the story he had authored. Camille sat with all of this for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice quieter than her usual register but no less controlled, that Mason had been right, that she had dismissed things he had seen clearly, and that she understood she owed him more than she currently knew how to articulate. Mason said he did not need an apology issued from a position of fear. That fear was a reasonable condition for the circumstances but a poor foundation for accountability, and that he would like to know what she intended to do with her understanding once the immediate situation was resolved, and she was back in a position to act on it. They considered each other across the concrete floor with the particular clarity that arrives when pretense has been comprehensively removed. And then Mason said they needed to move. The trap they designed was simple because complexity would give Julian room to maneuver. Camille composed a message in the private register she and Julian had developed over years of working together. The clipped, slightly self-deprecating phrasing she used when admitting something she found embarrassing, and she implied that her current circumstances were under someone else's management and that she would prefer Julian's people to whoever was presently with her. Julian responded in 4 minutes. He did not ask what had happened, did not ask if she was injured, did not ask for any detail that would establish his concern as genuine rather than strategic. He said he had assets available and asked where they were needed. He agreed to her suggested rendezvous before she had given specific coordinates, which meant he had already prepared for a version of this conversation. He directed her to a maintenance hangar at the edge of the commercial aviation district, registered to a Worthington Dynamics subsidiary, last hosting an official company function approximately 3 years ago, which was roughly how long ago the dissolution paperwork for the gray SUV's registration had been filed. Mason said no to the hangar without additional elaboration, and Naomi, listening through the channel, supported this with the specificity of someone who has spent enough years working violent crime to understand what a prepared environment means for the person being brought into it. Camille, for the first time since the sedan had turned onto Kelvin Street, did not attempt to override a decision being made in her presence. She asked Mason directly, and without the framing of authority, what he thought the right move was. He considered this for a moment, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to answer it as carefully as it had been asked. And then he described a plan that kept her at distance from any location Julian could have prepared, used the evidence already in hand, and gave the legal process something to work with before Julian had the opportunity to present his version of events to the board as established fact. Nora prepared a set of documents that appeared to be the acquisition fund's secondary authorization forms, internally consistent, correctly formatted, carrying a watermark sequence she had embedded as a tracer, and transmitted them to Julian through the executive file system as if Camille had authorized the transfer from a remote terminal. The documents could not initiate a real transaction. They would, however, record every access event, every metadata trace, every device that opened them. Naomi arranged for the channel between Mason's communications device and the police department's digital evidence recording system to be formally activated, meaning anything said on a call to that number was now part of a legally preserved record. The board's independent directors were contacted through Nora's emergency channel and told only that a developing situation required their attention before 6 o'clock, without specifics that could reach Julian through the informal networks he had clearly been using for months. Julian was careful on the recorded calls, speaking in the measured language of professional concern that a skilled attorney could later describe as ambiguous. But Dorian was not careful. Dorian called the number Camille had used and demanded, with the tone of a man who has spent too long near authority and absorbed its impatience without its discipline, that Camille present herself at the hangar with her primary biometric authentication device. When she said she was uncertain she could locate it, Dorian said that if she cooperated, no one would need to know exactly what had taken place on that bridge or who had been involved in making it happen. The words were unambiguous, irrecoverable, and tied without possibility of reinterpretation to the event he was claiming knowledge of. Naomi noted the timestamp. The operatives who had been on the bridge found the maintenance garage. Mason had moved Camille from the building before they arrived, and the two of them were 3 blocks east when he checked the device and saw the motion alert from the building's exterior camera. There was a brief encounter in a service corridor when 2 of the operatives tracking the area found Mason at an intersection he had not anticipated, and there was a moment of physical contact that resolved when Mason used the freight elevator door to separate himself from pursuit rather than press an advantage he had available. One of the men had been the one on the bridge who had caught him with the broken glass. Mason held the door closed with his full weight until he heard them take another route, and then he walked Camille to the vehicle without hurrying, because hurrying was what you did when the situation was no longer manageable, and this was not yet that. Camille asked why he had not gone back for the one who had injured him. Mason said he had a daughter who checked his hands when he came home, and that he preferred she not have reason to wonder what kind of person her father had become on days that went badly. Camille said nothing. She walked beside him to the car and got in. Naomi's message reached them as they pulled away. Julian had moved Nora Bell from her workstation to a locked file room on the building's 2nd floor and instructed 2 security personnel to hold her there pending what he described as an internal integrity review. The emergency board session convened at 6 o'clock in the morning in the Worthington Dynamics Executive Boardroom, and Julian Lockridge took his seat with the composed authority of a man who had prepared for this meeting in detail and had no reason to expect any result he had not already accounted for. He presented the situation in the measured cadences of a man performing reluctant duty. Camille had left the hotel in the company of her driver and had not made contact with anyone in the organization since. Mason Hart had demonstrated behaviors inconsistent with a routine assignment, had prevented security personnel from reaching the vehicle, and had separated the CEO from her protective detail. In the interest of obligations to shareholders and acquisition partners, Julian said he was prepared to assume interim executive authority. Dorian placed on the table a constructed record of Mason's personal financial history that reframed a standard mortgage refinancing as evidence of the kind of acute economic pressure that creates motive for extreme action. Harlan Beaumont, the board's senior independent member, looked at the document and moved his pen toward the interim authority form's signature block. The screen at the end of the room came to life. It had been dark since the meeting began, and none of the board members had been told it would be used, and for 2 seconds the room produced the particular stillness of a group of people recalibrating their expectations simultaneously. Camille appeared on it from a location that was clearly neither the hangar Julian had designated nor the industrial district from which he had expected her to emerge. She was seated, her jacket removed, and she had insisted before the broadcast on making visible the dressing she wore at her collar, where glass from the sedan's rear window had caught her, because she wanted the board to see what the night had looked like in physical terms rather than procedural ones. Julian said her name with an expression of relief so precisely constructed it was nearly credible. He asked what Mason had done to her. Camille did not answer the question. She looked at the board members, whose faces she knew better than most of them realized, and she said she was going to present several items, that the sequence was the argument. She shared the time-stamped route change Dorian had sent 11 minutes before their departure, the rental agreement for 3 SUVs contracted through a company in which Dorian held an ownership stake, the recording of Dorian demanding she bring her biometric authentication device, and stating that no one needed to know what had happened on the bridge. The draft announcement Julian had prepared the prior afternoon, describing her as mentally compromised and financially reckless. The access log showing Julian's workstation had opened the tracer documents at 4:41 in the morning, nearly 90 minutes before this meeting had officially been called, and the system data showing that her authentication access had been expanded by an administrative override 3 days prior, well before any scenario Julian might claim was reactive. Julian looked at the access log without speaking. Then he said that Dorian had clearly exceeded his authority, and that this reflected a failure of oversight for which Julian took personal responsibility. Dorian, who had not anticipated being offered as a margin of sacrifice, said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room that he had taken no action that had not been specifically directed, authorized, and requested by the man sitting 2 chairs to the left of the empty CEO seat. Naomi Keene entered through the main doors with 2 members of her investigative unit and said in the formal language of that process that Julian Lockridge and Dorian Pike were requested to accompany the investigators in connection with a complaint involving conspiracy, fraud, and fiduciary misconduct. The police unit positioned on the building's 2nd floor found Nora Bell in a locked archive storage room at 622, seated on a rolling chair, physically unharmed, and in possession of a thumb drive she had managed to conceal during the period of her confinement. Julian paused as the investigators moved toward him and directed his gaze at the camera, at Camille, at whoever he imagined was watching, and said with the careful bitterness of a man who has calculated every outcome and found that he miscounted one of them, that none of this would have been necessary if someone had not allowed a driver to hold information that a driver had no business possessing. Harlan Beaumont looked at the empty seat across the table, then at the screen where Camille's face remained steady, and said that was not what had happened here. That what had happened here was that a room full of credentialed people had listened to the voices closest to the seat of power and had overlooked the person who was simply paying attention, and that this was a failure he intended to address directly in the governance review, beginning the following week. The meeting ended at 7:40. Camille arrived at the secure location where Naomi had established a temporary staging area, and she found Mason seated on the step at the building's side entrance with his jacket folded across his knees, watching the street in both directions, with the quality of attention she now understood was not nervousness, but practiced vigilance she had mistaken for blankness for 6 years. She sat down beside him, something she had not done in proximity to a member of her support staff in longer than she could honestly recall. and told him she wanted to offer him a significant performance bonus, a formal commendation, and the position of Director of Personal Executive Protection, which would carry authority over all security personnel and protocols in the division. Mason listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he said no. He said the offer was generous and he understood the intention behind it, but the problem was not one that a title or a payment could restructure. The problem was that she had not been able to see his value until the moment she needed it, and that a bonus was a form of settlement offered to someone you have moved past the point of ordinary obligation toward, and that what he was being asked to accept in exchange for the last 12 hours was essentially financial confirmation of a relationship that still had not changed at its foundation. Camille was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wanted to apologize. He said he was listening. She looked at the street rather than at him, and she said she had not called him by his name in 6 years. She said she had dismissed his warnings in ways that were not about the quality of his assessment, but about whose assessment she was accustomed to weighing. She said she had allowed Dorian to humiliate him in settings where she held authority, and had chosen not to exercise it. She said she had doubted him after he had already saved her life, because the person she trusted most had told her to. Mason accepted the apology. He said accepting it did not mean the next version of their professional arrangement could begin from the same foundation as the one that had just concluded, and he gave her his conditions. The security division's protocols would be subject to an independent external audit. Employees at every level would have a formal, protected mechanism for reporting operational concerns without risk of retaliation. Drivers, maintenance personnel, and support staff whose work intersected with executive safety would be included in relevant security briefings. Nora Bell would be reinstated to full authority within 48 hours under explicit non-retaliation protection, and Camille would address the organization's internal culture publicly, not by describing herself as a survivor, but by acknowledging that she had built an environment where title determined credibility, and that this flaw was what the crisis had exploited. Camille agreed to all 5 conditions without qualification. There was no press event organized around her survival. The statement she issued was not about resilience or the loyalty of her team. It said, in direct language, that the organization had structural problems that predated the crisis by years, that she held herself accountable for sustaining them, and that the measure of correction would be outcomes rather than announced intention. 6 months later, the Worthington Dynamics Security Division had been formally restructured under an independent review process, and the position Mason Hart now held was called Director of Operational Safety and Personnel Protection, covering physical security for building staff, transport protocols for field teams, and the reporting mechanisms that allowed anyone to raise a concern without routing it through a chain of authority that might have reason to suppress it. Mason drove himself to work in a car he had owned for 4 years, arrived at the same time each morning, and had not altered his routine in any way visible from the outside, which was the way he preferred it. He had given Lily a shorter version of what had happened, enough to explain the scar on his left hand, which she had noticed the morning after, holding his hand at the kitchen table and tracing the edge of it with the careful attention of a 13-year-old who does not want to ask the question she is already asking. And he had told her it had been a long night, that things had gone wrong and then been corrected, and that he had been home on time, which was the part of the story he most wanted her to keep. The first major public convocation that Worthington Dynamics hosted after the restructuring. brought together executives from 17 companies and representatives from 2 regulatory bodies. Camille arrived in a sedan driven by a company pool driver who had been cleared through the new protocols. Mason was already inside when the car pulled to the curb, a junior events coordinator, new to the organization and eager in the way that people are when the impressions that matter are not always the ones they can identify, moved toward the sedan's door as Camille stepped toward it. She reached the handle herself, put her hand on it, and opened the door before the coordinator arrived. Not as a statement, not as theater, but as the simple and specific act of a person who no longer needs someone else to manage the distance between herself and the world. She brought Mason to the front of the room. She stood beside him and said, without prepared text and without the framing of a formal introduction, that this was Mason Hart, that he had saved her life, that he had saved the company she had spent her career building, and that he had done it by seeing clearly what every other person in her professional world had been too comfortable, too invested, or too credentialed to look at directly. Mason did not step forward. He did not position himself to receive the acknowledgement or gesture toward the attention. He said, to the assembled room and without the theater of humility, that he appreciated being recognized, and that he would ask the people in this room to extend that recognition, not specifically to him, but to the people in their own organizations who had tried to say something true and been told that their role did not entitle them to a hearing. When the event concluded and the building quieted to its residual staff, Camille found Mason near the exit and asked whether the route home was safe. It was the first time she had asked, and they both understood what the asking meant. Not a logistical inquiry, but something closer to the acknowledgement that there was judgment present she was willing to consult. Mason looked through the glass doors at the street ahead, ran through the relevant assessment with the automaticity of long practice, and said the route was clear. He said she would be home before the hour was out. Camille held the door handle for a moment, steady, unhurried, and then said, "Thank you, Mason." It was the first time in 6 years that the driver who had opened every door she had ever walked through had heard her speak his name.